safe and do not drive through the deep stuff. Patty Ann.
Well, the military trial for accused Fort Hood shooter Major Nidal Hasan is set to begin tomorrow, and there are growing concerns it could turn into a circus. Hasan is accused of opening fire on his fellow soldiers in 2009, killing 13, leaving more than 30 others wounded at Fort Hood, Texas. Hasan does not deny the charges, but military law prohibits him from entering a guilty plea because authorities are seeking the death penalty. Hasan, meanwhile, is also representing himself. He plans to argue that he was defending members of the Taliban who were fighting Americans in Afghanistan. Captain Glenn Solmese is a judge, advocate general, and professor of law at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. David Webb is the host of the David Webb Show on Sirius XM Patriot, also the co-founder of Tea Party 365 and a Fox News contributor. And Leslie Marshall is a syndicated radio talk show host. Thank you all three for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, we're going to start with the captain. Hasan admits he killed the 13 people and wounded the others, dozens of witnesses, yet this is considered a complex case. Why?
I think complex mostly, as you just noted, Patty Ann, is that he has fired his two previous counsel assigned to him. So that's difficult to begin with. And really, military justice is quite fair, and really we've only brought the death penalty forward in the last 20, 25 years about 20 times. And 11 of those appeals of those sentences for death penalty have been successfully appealed. So if you look, really compare it to Texas, there's been 500 executions in Texas over the same period of time. So I think it's really difficult to bring forward a case, a death penalty case. Military prosecutors don't ordinarily do death penalty or capital cases.
Yeah. Hasan, as you mentioned, has let go of his former lawyers. He is going to be representing himself. What impact does that have on the jury?
It's very, very difficult, I think, for anyone to recognize he doesn't have a law degree. He's obviously going to use this as a platform. It's particularly difficult for the presiding judge, who's a military Army colonel. And the colonel has to oversee the proceedings as a military judge and make sure it's fair. But it will be very, very difficult because he will grandstand. He will use this as a platform. He is a member of Al-Qaeda. And his conduct to date has been outrageous. What he's said, in that he is embarrassed by the fact that he's served in the U.S. Armed Forces. Embarrassed about serving in the U.S. Armed Forces, and he's begging Allah's forgiveness. That's very, very difficult to have that going on in a courtroom where you're trying to find justice.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, military juries have imposed just 16 death sentences in 30 years, and 11 of those have been overturned. So prosecutors will be anxious to protect against this verdict and or sentence being overturned, but it might be tricky. Let's go to our talk show hosts who join us now. David, meanwhile, 148 victims and their relatives are reportedly suing the U.S. government for $750 million. They say the government failed to protect against these killings. The group's lawyer, Reed Rubenstein, saying that Hasan's, quote, open, very obvious jihadism was overlooked out of misplaced respect for his ethnicity and his religion. Is this a valid suit?
That's a nice way of putting it. We have a culture where the Obama administration won't recognize Muslim terrorists for what they are. And within the Army ranks, there was a protected class of Muslim. Major Nidal Hasan, and actually I won't even use the title major. Nidal Hasan is a terrorist who in open areas and in speeches and in his writings made clear his radical views, but they would not report him. So there was a failure within the Army ranks under political correctness guidelines that led to this event. And here we have a guy who, by the way, when you talk about how he's going to play the system in the trial, he's been playing it for 4 years. Right. And the end point to this is important, that no matter what happens, even if convicted of the death penalty, he goes through the process, even if he asks for Supreme Court review, the president, if it happens in the next 3 years, has to sign off on his execution. And frankly, this is a weak-kneed president when it comes to dealing with Muslim terrorism. He has a non-existent policy, not a soft policy. And how do we expect him to give justice to the victims of Nidal Hasan, who is a Muslim terrorist?
Let's get to Leslie Marshall now. Leslie, as we mentioned, he is expected to argue that these killings were in defense of others, meaning members of the Taliban who are fighting Americans in Afghanistan. The jury here is 13 military officers who hold Hasan's rank or higher. As we heard from the captain, this is going to be hard for them to stomach, isn't it?
Well, not only hard for them to stomach, it's going to be very hard for him to present, because the newly appointed judges basically said that they are not going to accept that. as a means of defense. There is a saying that a lawyer has themselves as a client, has a fool for a client. And not only a fool, some people may say, when the captain speaks about how complex this is, this opens a floodgate, especially because he's not an attorney, especially because certainly there are areas, I believe, that are questionable mentally for this individual that will open up floodgates in the future for appeals. I think, honestly, even though I am a liberal in favor of the death penalty, I do feel the best thing for everyone involved, the military, the court, the victims, and their families, even though it's hard to stomach, is perhaps to have this man enter a guilty plea and accept life in prison without parole due to the military's lack of experience with death sentences and due to the number of appeals and overturns, as the captain spoke of earlier, that they have a history of. And this will make a mockery of the system and give him the platform that he desires.
We are going to have to leave it there. Captain Glenn Solmese, thank you so much for joining us, as well as David Webb. And a reminder, David tonight filling in on Hannity at 9 Eastern right here on Fox News, and Leslie Marshall, syndicated radio talk show host. Thank you all three for joining us today.
Thank you.
Don't forget the families, too, and the survivors. It's going to be a very, very difficult time for them.
Absolutely.
And we'll see what this guy does representing himself. I mean, we mentioned earlier that it could be a circus.
Yeah.
It could be.
Absolutely.
In Texas.